Hi, I'm Alessia, and you're about to watch a message that was preached at Calvary Fellowship in Miramar, Florida. At Calvary, we exist to help you take your next step with God. If you'd like to learn more about Calvary, make sure to download our mobile app on the App Store or Google Play Store by searching up My Calvary.
How's everybody doing? It's great to see you here. You know, 1 o'clock, you know how I feel about you. You know that. You know you're my favorite. And I'm glad to see you. So, we tell a lot of stories at my house. That's probably not a shock if you've been here for a while. And my kids love hearing stories. They love stories of when they were kids. They love stories when I was a kid or their mom was a kid, or when tell us how you and mom met and tell us what happened when I was 3 and all of that. And then and so sometimes, I mean, I just run out of stories or I just can't think of one. And what I'll do is I will tell them a story of a movie, and I may or may not insinuate that it happened in my life. So a while back, they were asking me to tell them a story. So I told them the story of the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark, except it was me who did all of that in his gap year in between high school and college. So they're like, wow, Dad, you fought the Nazis? Yes, I did. Anyway, so it's kind of a weird, anyway, so, but this is a while back. I mean, this is like, Mia was 6, Xander was 3, and Livy was maybe 6 months old. And so they say, Dad, tell us a story. And I say, all right, you know what? I want you to tell me a story, but I want you to tell me a story from the Bible. And so Xander, who's 3, he's like, great. I'm going to tell the story of Joseph. I'm like, all right, great. He says, Joseph was born, and his dad loved him, and his brothers were mean. So they took him, they threw him in a hole, and then Joseph died in that hole. And I'm like, that is not what happened at all. And then Mia steps in. Mia's 6 at the time. Now, Mia, you got to understand, is my theologian. She's the one, understands the Bible, better than anyone I know her age. And she says, I'll tell the story of Joseph. Joseph was born. His dad loved him. And his brothers were mean. They threw him into a hole. But then he climbed out of the hole, met Mary, and then Jesus was born. And I'm like, wrong Joseph. Same name, 1,500 years apart. And so I'm like, all right, tell me another story. And then Mia says, I'll tell you the story of Moses. I'm like, great. She says, Moses was walking through the desert one day and sees a burning bush. And then he walks over to it and tries to blow out the burning bush. And I'm like, no, he didn't. This was not like Moses' birthday that he's trying to blow out a candle. Anyway, and so what happens? And then, God tells him to free the slaves in Egypt. And I'm like, great. Xander, then what happened? Xander steps in. He says, then Moses came in and said, let my people go. And the mean old Pharaoh said no. So Moses grabbed him, threw him into the burning bush, and then he died. That is not what happened. I mean, this is like WWF Bible. And now, here's the thing, is that even if you only have like a cursory understanding of the Bible, you can kind of know when there's an issue with a story in the Bible if it's not being told correctly. And the reality is that most of us have been told stories from the Bible, but most of us don't know the story of the Bible. And I am convinced that the story of the Bible is almost as important as the stories that are found in it. And if you know someone, or maybe you are someone who is ready kind of to easily dismiss the Bible, more than likely it's because you haven't heard the story of the Bible. And honestly, if we were to leave here and go to the mall and start talking to people, and hey, who wrote the Bible? Most of us, would hear if we asked 1,000 people, we'd probably get 1,000 answers. But one of the common things, Jesus wrote the Bible. The truth is, Jesus did not write any of the Bible, although Jesus is the reason we have the Bible. Because as we said last time, the story of the Bible doesn't begin in the beginning. The story of the Bible begins towards the end of the middle, when the followers of Jesus started writing accounts of Jesus' life and resurrection, and eyewitnesses sharing what it is that they saw. And it was the resurrection that caused them to go from fearful disciples to these fearless leaders who had seen something that had totally transformed them, and that would be the resurrection. Because if the story of Jesus had ended at the cross, none of us would be here talking about it. No one would want to hear that story. He would have just been another wannabe preacher that Rome executed, as there were many wannabes that Rome executed. But it's only because of the resurrection that there is a story to tell. And that's why the disciples of Jesus wrote 4 accounts of Jesus' life. And in that world, when writing was so expensive, it was almost unheard of that we have 4 accounts of Jesus' life and Jesus' resurrection. But they wrote because this remarkable thing happened. And because the resurrection happened, that changed human history as we know it. And so these documents that were written, once again, it wasn't the Bible yet. It's just these documents that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had written. They were immediately considered valuable. They were immediately considered reliable because who wrote them. They were consequently considered sacred because of the story that was told, and later considered inspired. Very quickly, these 4 documents were considered by the early church to be scripture. But it's important to understand that after the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written, there still was no the Bible. That wouldn't happen for a couple hundred years. They were just 4 accounts of Jesus' life that were held in high regard, that the followers of Jesus would literally later risk their lives to protect. And that's where we pick up the story. And if you missed last week, you really owe it to yourself to listen to last week's message, because the way it works here is that they don't let me preach for 3 hours, which is really kind of, I think, how long it takes sometimes. But they don't let me do that because apparently you guys have things to do this afternoon. And more importantly, your kids are in the children's ministry, and if I went for 3 hours, your kids would be in charge by the end, and everyone who works in the children's ministry would be held hostage. So anyway, that's why we don't do that. So basically, this whole series, if you can kind of imagine it, it's about a 3-hour message that I'm breaking up into 4 chunks. So that's why, previously on, and we just I'm trying to catch you up. So, but that's where we pick up the story, right? Is that people are even at sometimes kind of giving their lives to protect these documents, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then the writings of Paul and the writings of Peter and that sort of thing. So, but what we have to understand is the gospel writers tell us that when Jesus, at the very end, before Jesus ascended into heaven, Jesus gave his disciples a mission. And I want to read that to you here in the book. It's at the end of Matthew's account. It says, "Then the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. And when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, 'All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age.'" Jesus is saying, go. And that is, another translation says, go into all the world. The idea was, don't stay home, go everywhere and share this message. So you know what they did? They went home, doing the exact opposite thing they were supposed to do. They went home for 3 years until this moment happened when there was this young guy named Stephen. Stephen was preaching. He was a young leader in the church. He was preaching, and he was killed by the Jewish leaders who had handed Jesus over to be arrested. And when that happened, I want to show you what took place. It says this in Acts chapter 8. "On that day, the day Stephen died, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Jerusalem and Samaria." Look what happens. "But those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. And soon after, one of the people that was there when Stephen died was a young man whose name was Saul of Tarsus. Saul of Tarsus later becomes the Apostle Paul. The Apostle Paul, or Saul of Tarsus, was a guy who was, not a Christian. He hated Christians. He was arresting Christians, beating Christians, and killing them if necessary, if they had been, because they were taking people that were Jewish and converting them to Christianity. And so now, you know how in your yearbook there were people that were voted most likely to succeed? In Paul's yearbook, he was voted most likely not to convert to Christianity. And so for him to convert to Christianity was a huge thing. But Saul becomes the Apostle Paul. Paul then starts traveling throughout all the Roman world and is preaching now that Jesus is risen from the dead. He's an expert in all things of the Hebrew Scriptures. And so now the biggest struggle that everyone in the Roman world has, that is non-Jews, that they love the message of Jesus, that they are embracing Jesus as their Savior, but there's this idea that they have to give up, which is a little bit tough for them. The thing that they're giving up is the idea of polytheism, and that is that there's not many gods, there's just one God. Now, I know that that's not a big deal for us, because unless you embrace a Hindu philosophy, pretty much everyone else in the world has accepted the idea of, if you believe in God, that there's one. And so, but the challenge is, in that in ancient times, people didn't typically convert from one faith to another. That's not really how it worked. People didn't leave Islam to become Christians, or leave Christianity to become Buddhists, or Buddhists to become Hindu. That's not how it worked. Every region, every nation, so whether you were Greek, whether you were Roman, whether you were barbarian, whatever you were, you had your own gods. Many families even had their own gods. And so when you moved from place to place, you just put all your gods in a sack and you moved to wherever you were going, and then you got your new house and you put your gods up, and then you set up your family altar. But nobody really cared what God you worshiped. In fact, you might even adopt one of the other gods from the area that you're in, and if one of those gods aren't working out, you kind of throw them in the fire. Well, that wasn't really a god. So converting wasn't normal, and the Roman Empire didn't care who you worshiped as long as you paid homage to Caesar as Lord and you didn't dishonor the Roman gods. Now, Christianity comes along and says, well, you have to give up you got to give up all these other gods. And I think it's an important thing to understand is that in the first, and this is going to sound weird, in the 1st and 2nd century, Christians were considered atheists. And I know that sounds strange, but Christians were considered atheists because they didn't worship the pantheon of Greek or Roman gods. They didn't worship any images or statues. They worshiped one God that they claimed to be the only one. And this was a little bit of an obstacle for people who were Gentile or non-Jews, because they had kind of embraced, more of like a smorgasbord of gods, like, there's probably a whole bunch. And the idea of one God what seemed very novel to these people who were new, just coming to know Jesus. However, when they came to know Jesus, they got very interested in Jesus' background, his upbringing, the faith that he followed, and the scriptures that Jesus grew up revering. Now, so that leads us to the first point, if you're a note taker, and that is this, that Gentile Christians got interested in the Hebrew scriptures after they became Christians. Now, their interest in a particular Jew is what got them interested in the Jewish scriptures. And that's kind of how it works. You get interested in a person, and then you get interested in what that person is into. Now, if you've been around here at Calvary for a while, I've told you this in the past, but I was not a particular good student in school. I didn't really hit my stride until college, where I did very well, but I didn't really, 1st through 12th grade, I was, not there yet. And I've told you, I had to repeat. I was on the 5-year plan in high school, so I tell people that, what was it like being a senior? And I said, best 2 years of my life. And so, and I didn't really care about school until I met my wife. My wife, we met at a party. She was very interested in school. She was on a scholarship at FAU, doing very well. And so I met her, and I was instantly in love with her. And so we met at this party, and so she's telling me about school and how she loves everything about school, and she loves the books and the classes and the lectures and the tests and all that. And all I can think about is, wow, she's so pretty. And so then she asks me the question, do you like school? And so once again, I did not do well in school. In fact, I went to summer school every year, even my 5th year I still had to go to summer school so I could finish and have enough credits to graduate. And then she says, do you like school? And what does 19-year-old Bob say after he sees this girl for the first time and thinks, I'm going to marry her somehow? And I did. I'm like, I love school. I love it. And I love you. And so now listen, I love school. I love it so much, I go more than anyone I know. And so now she tells me this all the time, that our relationship was built on a lie. And I'm like, it's not true. It wasn't a lie. 6 years later, I was running a college, by the way. So it wasn't a lie. It was a prophecy. So that's that. So, but you got to understand, So just like how it happens when you fall in love, you get interested in what that person is interested in. When these non-Jews got interested in Jesus, they were not interested in Judaism. They got interested in a particular Hebrew, which is why they got interested in the Hebrew scriptures. And so, and once again, there would be people who would believe, like Gentiles who would believe that the Hebrew God was the real God. And if you read the New Testament, they're called God-fearers. And but once again, they didn't convert to Christianity. They didn't convert to Judaism because that kind of involved some stuff. You had to accept all 613 laws in the Old Testament, and then it would involve going into the water of what was called a mikvah, which is like a pool. It was like kind of like what we would call baptism. And then for the men, they'd have to be circumcised at the end of it. And you can imagine that kind of created, so. You're probably not surprised that there were more female converts to Judaism than male, because there was the cost of admission was a little higher if you were a man. And so I'm guessing that kind of created some tense conversations between husbands and wives. And he's like, are you sure this is where you want to go worship? Because there's like other options. And that they're not asking as much, because I think that circumcision and giving up bacon is a lot to ask. And they're like, no, this is where, anyway, so that created problems. And so anyway, for the most part, there's things that I shouldn't say. So anyway, for the most part, Gentiles weren't interested in the Jewish sacred text previously for a lot of good reasons. Jews kept to themselves. Jews ate different kinds of food. Jews refused to work on the Sabbath. Jews wouldn't allow you to marry their daughters, wouldn't allow their sons to marry your daughters. And in the first century, right, the Apostle Peter, who's probably one of Jesus' most famous disciples, 15 years after the resurrection, he had still never entered the home of a Gentile person. I mean, that's how big the divide was, and more than likely had never invited a Gentile into his home. And so inside of Israel, once again, it's very easy to be isolated, but outside of Israel, where there were, there were little pockets of Jews in every major city, whether it was Ephesus, Rome, Corinth, parts of Galatia, but everywhere they settled, Jews kept to themselves. And so, Gentile people had virtually no interest in the Jewish religion until they were introduced to the gospel. They heard the teachings of Jesus, and that now, whether it was through the Apostle Paul or Peter or other eyewitnesses of the resurrection, and they discovered the Jewish texts, which were called the Law and the Prophets. It was not called the Old Testament. That would come a lot later, and that's next week, by the way. We'll talk about that. But then they realized that the Hebrew Scriptures were the backstory to the story of Jesus, and they got very interested. Now, the thing that happened was that they were like, hey, we want to read more about this, and they started reading the Hebrew Scriptures, and they were seeing Jesus everywhere in the text, even places where Jesus wasn't. And it was, you can actually find some of this online, or if you're a nerd like me, you go to like old bookstores and find commentaries on this stuff. But I have a commentary on Song of Solomon, which is a book of the Bible. It's a document that Solomon, the king of Israel, wrote. It's called the Song of Solomon. It's a song. He's a one-hit wonder. That's the only one in the Bible. But anyway, it's the story it's this amazing love story of how Solomon met his wife. They fell in love. They get married. Their wedding night. Then they have a big fight after, which you're like, oh yeah, this guy really understands marriage. And then it kind of all works out. And then at the end of this story, they're older and they're looking back on their relationship. These early Christians started trying to interpret everything as this is Jesus and this is the church. And some of it is just like, no, I don't think it is. And so we're all going to be Bible scholars for a minute. And we're going to see if this passage in Song of Solomon, if you decide like, yeah, I think those early guys might have gotten it wrong. So let's see. All right. So here's the first part. How beautiful you are, and how pleasing, my love, with all your delights. Now, pause. Okay, so now it can go either way here. Is this Solomon talking about his wife? Is it God talking about how lovely the church is? We're not sure, but like any Bible problem, you know how you solve almost all Bible problems with a verse? You read it in context. That's how you figure out what it is. So here's the next verse. He says, your stature is like that of the palm, and your breasts like clusters of fruit. Here we go. Next one. I said, I will climb the palm tree and I will take hold of its fruit. Now, once again, and you're like, I'm not a Bible scholar, but I'm pretty sure he's talking about having sex with his wife. And you're like, I don't think Jesus is climbing a tree. And like, you would be correct. And once again, but these early Christians, they got so caught up in, they're like, I think everything in the Old Testament, like, no, some stuff was just about relationships, and you don't have to force it. And once again, there are actually, you can actually find sermons that were written, and because once again, I'm like, it's only like nerds like me that I read old sermons that were written like 200 years ago, and you find that they're like forcing this text to say something that it isn't. And by the way, more on this next week, where the Christians adopt the Hebrew Scriptures, but then now what are you going to do with it? There's like, once again, 613 laws. What do you do with all those laws? Do you follow all of them? Do you follow some of them? Do you follow none of them? Or if you just follow some of them, which ones? And this has created problems in the church even to this day. And you're like, well, I wasn't planning on coming back next week. Well, maybe you should, because that's what I'm going to talk about it. So anyway, but in the process of reading the Hebrew Scriptures, now this is important, they discovered something. They discovered that the Jewish religion, the Jewish faith, was older than any of the faiths or religions of the Romans or the Greeks. And these Gentile Christians learned something, they discovered something that they had just learned that the Jews had always believed. And here's the second point, and that is that Gentile Christians discovered that the Jews had always believed there was one God. They had always believed that there was one God. Now, a little bit of history before we get back to the plot line, because this is important. In the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries, the Romans persecuted Christians. And that's kind of understood. They threw Christians to the lions. We talked about that last time. So all this happens, and you might be thinking, well, why is it that they persecuted the Christians, but they didn't persecute the Jews, even though the Jews didn't pay homage to Caesar and they didn't worship or sacrifice to the Roman gods? I mean, so what was the point? Why did the Jews get a pass, but the Christians get persecuted? It's a good question, and here's the reason why. Is because the ancient the Romans honored ancient things. They honored ancient things, and the Romans knew that the Jewish religion was older than the story of Romulus and Remus, the Roman gods who were the gods who supposedly founded the city of Rome, that the Jewish religion was older than the pantheon of Greek gods, and the Jewish scripture was older than Rome or the Roman religious system. So even though they didn't honor Yahweh as God, they honored the fact that the Jewish religion was older than theirs, so the Jews got a pass. But as the Jewish Christians as these Gentile Christians are reading the Jewish scriptures, they're shocked to discover that the oldest religion that anyone knew about recognized that there was only one God from the very beginning. And the implications here are huge. That is that since ancient times, that every other nation, every other family, every other culture that had worshiped multiple gods had it wrong. And the Jews had known this from the beginning, because when they opened up that first scroll that we call Genesis, here's what we find. It says this: in the beginning, God. Now, here's the challenge that we have, is that we've heard this so many times, we've read this so many times, we've heard people argue about this online ad nauseum, that we miss the huge implications that this original text shares. This was shocking in the ancient world. And that every other non-Jewish cult or creation story, they would think that it would start in the beginning, the gods. But it doesn't. And see, the word Genesis is the Hebrew word Bereshith. The word Bereshith literally means in the beginning. The first 5 books of the Bible, which were written by Moses, usually are called by the first word in Hebrew. So it's called, the first 3 words in Hebrew are Bereshith, Elohim, bara. In the beginning, God created, or bara, which means created without pre-existing materials. And so the challenge is that it writes this, and this is something that's so huge and actually has implications for all of us. In the 19th and 20th century AD, I'm talking like the last 100 to 150 years, archaeological finds, this is the way archaeologists thought. They found all of these other creation stories that were found in Egyptian, Sumerian, Canaanite, and Babylonian cultures. They thought, hey, these sound a lot like the Hebrew creation stories, and so the Hebrews must have borrowed from these other ancient stories to create their own story. And that was the initial assumption. The problem is, and I want you to know this is important, scholarship and archaeologists have pretty much abandoned that idea. And I'm not talking about Christians. These are people who are not Christians. They have, looking at the texts, they have abandoned that idea. And here's why. And they have understood that Genesis did not borrow from other creation myths. They have said that Genesis stands in startling contrast to other creation myths because Genesis is a worldview unto itself, an extraordinarily ahead of its time worldview. In fact, the scientific community, and that is modern science, wouldn't even begin to catch up to the first statement of Genesis until 1927, when a Belgian priest suggested the theory that we now call the Big Bang Theory, that the universe had a beginning. And you got to understand, we assume that. And we kind of come to the idea of science assuming that the universe had a beginning. Up until 1927, from the 4th century BC, from the time of Aristotle, everyone assumed that the universe simply existed, that it was eternal. To give you an idea, Albert Einstein embraced the idea that the universe has always existed. And I think we can all agree that Albert Einstein was a fairly smart individual. Even though anytime you get called an Einstein, it is not because you're smart, right? Like, nice job, Einstein! I don't think we're really honoring that individual properly. That's a story for another time. All right, so science, by the way, the interesting thing about the scientific community is that they rejected the idea of the Big Bang because they said it sounded too much like the Genesis account, which I think is kind of funny. But anyway, in 1964 AD, that is about 55 years ago, with the discovery of cosmic microwave background radiation, the view that the universe has always existed was abandoned. Scientists almost now universally agree that in a trillionth of a second, the universe expanded at extraordinary speed from the size of something smaller than a pebble to its current astronomical shape. Or put it another way, in the beginning, God. So the debate today is not, did the universe have a beginning? The debate today is, was this creation personal, purposed, and intentional? And that is a story for another time. But the significance of what comes next is lost on us, and the reason that it's lost on us is because we come to the text already making that assumption. So to put it another way, Moses is building a case that's no longer needed because the case that he's making ultimately succeeded over others. And that's the point. He's making something that we already assume. But Moses is writing to a group of ancient people who all they have known is Egyptian slavery and the power of the Egyptian gods. And this is the thing that he's saying. Here's the last point in your outline. The creation account was not about how God created the world, but that one God created the world. Now, we all understand that. We all understand that there's a difference between that something happened or how something happened. So my wife is one of these people that wants to know every ingredient in everything that she eats. I am an individual who wants to enjoy his life. So we differ in that way. So my wife sometimes ruins things for me by telling me what's in them. So this happened about 5 years ago. This happened. She ruined something for me. And so 5 years ago, the McDonald's on Miramar Parkway brought back the McRib. I can't even begin to tell you how much joy filled my heart. It's like we were having another child. I was so happy. You got to understand something about the McRib. The McRib is a limited time engagement. The McRib, I've done more research than I should have. The McRib can be brought back by any McDonald's owner at his own discretion for as long as he wants. And so that's just something you need to know. But it's totally unpredictable when it's going to show up or when it's going to leave. Unlike the pumpkin spice craze, which arrives every September and takes over our lives. Just for the record, I hate pumpkin spice anything. I'm telling you, and they pumpkin spice everything, and it's only a matter of time before they come out with the pumpkin spice Bible. And people are going to be like, oh my God, have you read the Revelation and the Pumpkin Spice Bible? The apocalypse never was so delicious. Anyway, I don't even want to hear it. And so, I don't know who I just imitated there, but there you have that. So anyway, back to the McRib. So the McDonald's by my house brings back the McRib. Now, because I check this website occasionally, McRibLocator.com, and right now there are 3 McDonald's in Spain and 1 in the United States in Brooksville, Oregon, at least as of Friday afternoon, that is offering the McRib. But 5 years ago, they brought the McRib, the one right down the street from my house, and I bought a McRib, and I brought it home, and I got fries, and I got a soda, and I laid it out, and then my wife started reading me the ingredients. She's like, Bob, don't do it. And so she's reading me all the ingredients, and I don't know why, but she got to this one ingredient, and she's like, do you know what this is? She's like, this ingredient in the McRib is the foam that they use in yoga mats. Now, typically I wouldn't care because I don't even do yoga, right? But my problem is that all I could picture was a person finishing a yoga mat and it's all sweaty, and now I just pour barbecue sauce on it and I'm taking a bite of a sweaty yoga mat while somebody's doing warrior pose, and I don't know what happened to me, but I'm like, it's dead to me. The McRib is dead to me. And I'm telling you, it happened. She ruined it. The other day, she started telling me, she says, oh, hey, don't eat that hot dog. You know what's in it? And I'm like, woman, do not ruin my life. This is all I have left. All right? So anyway, so my point is we all acknowledge that there's a difference between the what and the how. And Moses' primary point, you're like, wow, that's a big jump from the McRib to all of creation. I know, but yeah, I just traversed the two. All right. So Moses' primary point isn't to share every detail of how God did it. His primary point in showing us, and this was mind-blowing in the ancient world, was that God did it. Listen, Genesis is not Moses' explanation of how the universe came into being. This is where we get mixed up. He's making the point that God created the heavens and the earth, not the gods, just Yahweh. He says, in the beginning, God created, not Egypt's Amun-Ra, not the Babylonians' Marduk, who created the earth as he rode into his epic battle. And by the way, there's so much background in this, and if you want to nerd out, you can Google this. Oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. The Enuma Elish is the name of their creation story. Marduk rides in, and by the way, I say Marduk, not Marmaduke. Marmaduke is a cartoon. Marduk was the Babylonian god, and he rides in on this epic battle on his 2 steeds, Slaughterer and Merciless, which sound like the name of 2 80s heavy metal bands. And he rides, he stands astride on these 2 stallions, defeats the goddess Tiamat by shooting an arrow through her throat, and then he splits her body in half. Could you imagine Babylonian boys? Like, you didn't have to get them up for church. They're like, he's going to rip her in half. Anyway, so they were excited. I can only imagine what kind of crafts they were doing. So he rips apart the goddess Tiamat. With the top half, he creates the heaven. With the bottom half of her body, he creates the earth. But in Genesis, we find something extraordinarily different, not even close to any of the other cultures, not borrowed from any other cultures. It says this, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Genesis is nothing like the Egyptian, Canaanite, Sumerian, Babylonian creation stories, where the gods are at odds with each other, where they're at war with each other, where gods are creating other gods out of body parts and fluids. And this, by the way, brings up the other, way ahead of its time, epic statement. Once again, in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian story, you got to read 5 books before you even get to the creation of mankind. When you read Genesis, I mean, this is like right up front. And so let me read you a passage from the Enuma Elish. This is what Marduk, the Babylonian god, says. He says, I will establish a savage. Man shall be his name. Savage man I will create. He shall be charged with the service of the gods, that they might be at ease. In these ancient creation myths, mankind is an afterthought to take the load off of lazy gods. Genesis is completely different. And by the way, the ancient peoples that embraced these mythologies about these other gods. Like, individuals had no rights. I mean, women had no rights, no status, no hope. No one had any intrinsic value. And the violence and injustice of the gods justified the violence and injustice of their leaders. And it justified the violence and injustice of the men and women that worshiped them. And the leaders of these foreign nations and pagan cults, these kings were essentially acting like their fathers and mothers in the heavens. And then you come to Genesis. And it is in stark contrast, I mean, with no parallel. It is so forward-thinking that so much of our culture is still trying to catch up with what was written so many centuries ago. Now listen, Genesis tells us, in Genesis, the religion that they found out, like these early Christians find out, that this religion, these books that were written were so much older than any of the current religions of the first century. Genesis says what no of these other pagan stories would read. And here's what it says. It says this: "Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, the birds of the air, over the livestock and all the wild animals, over the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them." You see, in the Jewish text, the creation of mankind, the creation of womankind, is the pinnacle, not the afterthought of creation. And what that means is this, is that every man, every woman, and every child has dignity that is established at creation. And see, the important thing about this is that this is like, so much later, other cultures are trying to adopt this, the thing that the Jewish text tells us from the very beginning. This is why these ancient these scholars and archaeologists said, look, the Jews didn't borrow from one of these other ancient myths, that the book of Genesis is a worldview unto itself. And that's why the verses that we just read, 500 years later, 1,000 years later, 1,500 years later, they still were trying to catch up to what the Hebrew scriptures had told us. That's why in the very beginning, God tells the Jewish people, don't make idols. Don't make an idol of me, Yahweh. Don't make an idol or images out of animals or anything that crawls on the ground or anything that flies in the air. You're going to have no other gods besides me because there aren't any other gods. Now, this is in contrast to the Egyptian pantheon of gods that they had just escaped from. So he says, you're not going to worship nature. Instead, you will rule over nature. The implication is this. He's telling these people that had just left Egyptian slavery, you are the stewards of this world. And that is an idea that we are still wrestling with as a culture to this day. In that day, every pagan culture worshiped nature, worshiped the elements of nature, or worshiped animals in nature, or some mixture of all three. But from the very beginning, God established a unique worldview that every person, that mankind, womankind, was created in his image. This is unthinkable. Listen, I've said this before, but this is why I believe that every woman should be a Christian. Because Jesus elevated the status of women to the place where it was originally given in Genesis, that both men and women are equal, created in God's image. But that's not the way society saw it. Jesus came in and elevated the status of women, and that's why I believe every woman should follow Jesus, and that's why so many women do. But ladies, I want to tell you something, that the God of the Jews, who became the God of the Christian, gave dignity to women in this world in a way that our culture is still trying to catch up to today. Our problem is that we read Genesis and we get distracted. We read Genesis and say, oh, Moses is trying to explain the how. He's trying to explain how the sausage gets made. That's not the goal here. The point isn't how. The point is that God created it, and we get confused and we start focusing on the timing and the sequence and all that, and we miss the magnificence of these ancient statements. That Moses dropped a bomb in these ancient cultures when he introduced a radically different, unparalleled worldview that the world is still trying to catch up to. And he is saying this to every single person, that you are not a means to an end to serve lazy gods. You are the pinnacle of creation, and I'm going to make you as close to me as possible. I'm going to make you in my image. That means that every man, every woman, and every child that you encounter bears the image of their Creator, so we better be careful how we treat them. According to the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian story, you were born a slave to the gods. You have no individual dignity. You have no individual rights. There is no redeemer, and there is no afterlife. And if you talk to Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett, or probably the most famous Richard Dawkins, all the new atheists, you know what they'll tell you? That you were born a slave to your DNA, that you have no free will, that there is no redeemer, and there is no afterlife. It's not an original idea. But in the very beginning, we are introduced in the Hebrew Scriptures to a God who saves, to a God who redeems, to a God who delivers, and to a God who never, ever gives up on us. A God who amazingly gives us the freedom to choose and then honors the choices that we make. And then the God of the Jews, Yahweh, does something so totally contrary to the gods of that culture. He goes to work to reverse the consequences of mankind's decision to choose against him. When God came to earth in the person of Jesus. You see, the early Christians, even though they didn't get it all right, and some of it was kind of funny and all that, they did get something right. They realized, they saw the connection between their faith and the Hebrew Scriptures, and they moved quickly to adopt the Hebrew Scriptures as their own. And thus, the stage was set for the inclusion of the Jewish Scriptures into the Christian Bible. And that was not without its struggles, and next week we're going to talk about that in some detail. But I want to close with this. I took my son to Atlanta a couple weeks ago for his 10th birthday. Turning 10 at our house is a big deal. And so, I'll tell you the whole story some other time. It's an amazing story. It was one of the best couple days of my life. But he wanted to go see this show. And I got him tickets to the show. And then we flew to Atlanta to see the show. And then we met, some of my friends were there. And we had a great time with their families. And it was incredible. And so I was able on the way home to get us upgraded. Because on the way there, we were sitting in the back with the mutants. But then we got upgraded on the way up. And so obviously it was my son's first time up there in first class. And he was like, the flight attendants. The one thing he said, he goes, the flight attendants are so much nicer up here. And I'm like, yeah, but the people are jerks up here. Anyway, like the passengers, but the flight attendants are super nice. So anyway, but he got a Coke and a real glass, and then the flight attendants bringing him snacks, and it was like, well, do you want Cheez-Its or Oreos? And he's like, oh, I'm not really sure. And the flight attendant was like, well, do you want both? And he's like, for real? And he's like, man, I'm living in the lap of luxury. So anyway, so we're sitting there, and I don't know, it's just been 2.5 days, just him and I and his friends and some of my friends. And I mean, it was just like 2 of the greatest days of my life. And I'm like getting super emotional. And I say to him, and I'm like, buddy, I'm so proud of you. And he says to me, and he says, Dad, you say that all the time, but why are you proud of me? I haven't done anything. And I said, Zan, I don't say I'm proud of you because of what you do. I'm proud of you because of who you are and the person that you're becoming. And then he smiled, he had his soda in his hand, and he smiles and he says, Dad, I think I get it. And by the way, I'm proud of you too. Now listen, we have a heavenly Father who values us, not because of what we do for him, but because he created us in his image. And we are created with value, with worth, with dignity, and loves us because we are his. Let's pray together. And God, we want to thank you so much that we can know you, that we can open these ancient texts, but they can speak to us right now. And that because we're created in your image, we can know you better and hopefully reflect who you are in this world, that others might come to know you as well. So God, help us. Our prayer is that we just want to be more like you. And we pray it in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen.
Thanks for watching this week's message. Make sure to click the subscribe button below to stay up to date with all the things happening here at Calvary. God bless you.